Okay, so today we're going to talk about Welcome to 1984. And what happened to... Oh, I know what happened. I set my iPad down on my slide. Welcome to 1984, or It's Not Well That It Ends Orwell. Now, I gave that one a lot of thought, so I'm sure our former English teacher here will critique me at the end of the class. And okay, A+. Okay, well, that's fine. You can do it at the end of class, too. But you know, as I've watched trends, I see the book 1984 is more and more prophetic. Now, of course, so far we're 35 years beyond 1984, but I certainly think we're at a point where these things are happening. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So today's thing is going to be divided mainly into two parts. There's going to be talk about cultural issues and some politics that relate to the 1984, and then we'll do a Mideast update. So if you don't want to listen to the first part, you can always fast forward to the second part. And of course, come back and listen to it later and do it from a different computer, because then we get more views. So I'm just kidding. But we talk about the convergence of events, and we see a lot of this. More and more of these things are converging as we go forward each week. We've talked a little bit in the past about the weather, and since I'm involved in some... Oh, excuse me. Right here? Okay. We've talked about the weather, and I've been involved in some litigation involving farms and that type of thing. And it's really bad in Ohio. I mean, if pretty much past the time when they can plant. Maybe they can get some soybeans in. But really right now it looks like about half of the crop in Ohio has been planted, and this is true throughout a lot of the Midwest. I know here locally, some areas had 5 inches of rain the other night. It's been incredible. I mean, it's the wettest spring I can remember. And on top of that, not only are there food crises all over, and I talked about some of that last week, now we see this is from the Wall Street Journal yesterday, the bugs that we can't live without. And what they're finding is that we have a problem with bees. I was reading an article this week, I don't remember where it was in a mainstream publication, that bee colonies continue to collapse around the world, and bees are very important to the pollination of crops. If you don't have pollination of crops, you don't have crops. You don't have crops, you don't have food. You don't have, or things that are made out of crops you can't make if you don't have the crops. And it's this cascading effect. So when we analyze, for example, when you're looking at a farm business and that type of thing, some of the things they do is they do grain storage, they do hauling of grain, they do all sorts of things connected to grain. But if you don't have the grain in the first place, nobody's planted a crop, all the other stuff falls apart. And there's a cascading effect. And the other thing is, not only are we having problems with bees, but insect species are disappearing and dying off at an alarming rate. And a lot of these are essential to the production of crops. So it brings into focus when we read Revelation and we see that there's a great famine coming, or that bread costs a day's wages. You can easily see how those type of things can come about, and come about in very short order. And these things, again, are, from human perspective, are pretty much unprecedented. We have an Ebola outbreak in Africa. It's spread to the Congo. There's fears that it might go to Tanzania and other countries in Central Africa. And there's no cure for this. We talked about the swine flu in China and Asia that may result in the slaughter of 200,000 pigs. So there's just this cascading effect. But I wanted to focus for just a moment on Orwell. One of the things that Orwell noted in his book, 1984, in his appendix, he has a section called The Principles of Newspeak. And here's what Newspeak was. The purpose of Newspeak was not only to provide a medium of expression for the worldview and mental habits proper to the devotees of Ingsoc, that really meant English socialism, but to make all other modes of thought impossible. It was intended that when Newspeak had been adopted once and for all, and Old Speak forgotten, a heretical thought, that is, a thought diverging from the principles of Ingsoc, should be literally unthinkable, at least so far as thought is dependent on words. Its vocabulary was so constructed as to give exact and often very subtle expression to every meaning that a party member could properly wish to express, while excluding all other meanings and also the possibility of arriving at them by indirect methods. This was done partly by the invention of new words, but chiefly by eliminating undesirable words and by stripping such words as remained of unorthodox meanings, and so far as possible of all secondary meanings whatever. Now, does this sound a little bit like the world that we live in today? And the answer is, boy, it sure does sound like that. There's an interesting article, was in the Wall Street Journal on Thursday or Friday, the turnabout on religious freedom. And one of the people that they interviewed, the primary person that they interviewed for that, was a University of Pennsylvania law professor named David Skeel. And David Skeel had written a book a number of years ago called True Paradox: How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Complex World. Now, in the university, that type of thinking that Christianity might actually be important is that's heresy in the secular world. But he's a tenured professor at University of Pennsylvania, and there's another professor there, Amy Wax, who is also conservative. But, these people are under attack. They get criticized. Now, he thinks it's not as bad as maybe an Amy Wax thinks it is. She was attacked in a little bit different way. But one of the things they were talking about was that there's been sort of a shift a little bit on the Supreme Court, in terms of religious liberty and religious freedom, and how that's viewed at the U.S. Supreme Court level. And this is important because the Supreme Court, of course, is a very important institution in our society. But what happens in the United States often translates or immigrates or migrates, I guess it is, to other societies and cultures that might share some of the values that the United States has. And that's not to say, by the way, don't anybody say that I'm saying that the United States is perfect. We're not. We've got a big mess. But in his book, True Paradox, and then looking at some of the recent Supreme Court decisions, Professor Skeel says that he sees a battle coming. And what he thinks the battle's going to be in the future, he says, the biggest battles I suspect are going to be over free exercise, the First Amendment's second clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So he notes that in 1993, this is 25 years ago, Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And what Congress was trying to do was to say, look, religious freedom is very important. The courts have gotten away from it. And so the courts, when they look at this, they need to apply a very high level when it impacts your religious freedom, they have to apply strict scrutiny. In other words, you have to have a really good reason to impact somebody's religious freedom or their free exercise. Now, what's happened is some of the courts have said, well, the First Amendment and the free exercise clause applies to the states through the 14th Amendment, but this doesn't apply to the states. So the states are free to put restrictions on. And it's led to a lot of really stupid decisions. But the interesting thing is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, this was passed during the Clinton administration, the first year of the Clinton administration. And the vote in Congress, in the Senate, to approve it was 97-3. This does not happen in today's world. In fact, one of the sponsors of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was a guy named Senator Chuck Schumer from New York. Now, this has led to a number of different things with, and so there are battles, and I think Professor Skeel is right in that the battle's not really framed correctly by the court, by the Supreme Court. So on the one hand, you have these people like, we want all of our freedoms. We want to do what we want. We don't want any restrictions. But when it comes to people who want to engage in the free exercise of religion, they put all kinds of restrictions in place. But the one is protected in the Constitution, religious free exercise of religion, and the others are not. And so we are really in this battle. And a lot of it relates around the use of language. So Skeel notes this, that attitudes shifted in the legal academy, too, with a growing body of scholarship, contending that the First Amendment is too favorable toward faith. Now, I went to law school, and I can tell you, this is exactly 100% correct. Well, we know that the Constitution says Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But we have to define what those words really mean. Now, they seem very, very clear to everyone that has a brain that's minimally functioning. But in the world of Newspeak, not so much. And there's now, as he's noted, there's an interest in putting limits on the free exercise of religion. The article continues, that's in part the result of a great incongruity in the ideology of the contemporary left. Progressives insist social reforms implemented in the name of individual autonomy can achieve their aims only by outright coercion. An example would be the Hobby Lobby case. In the Hobby Lobby case, the question was, could you force a company to require them to provide medical coverage that would require them to have medical abortion coverage in their medical policy that they provide to their employees? And everybody got all upset. And look, there's been this concerted push in California to require churches to provide that coverage. And a lot of churches are standing up against it and saying, no, we're not going to do it. Now, Skeel's view is, well, you should just lawyer up and go to the court and challenge these things. You just should not do it and suffer the consequences. And that's always great when you sit in an ivory tower in a university in Philadelphia and you don't have to live in the real world where this stuff really impacts you. Again, from the article, notwithstanding Justice Anthony Kennedy's assurance in Obergefell versus Hodges, in which Justice Kennedy said that the faithful may continue to advocate with utmost sincere conviction that by divine precepts, same-sex marriage should not be condoned. Now, this is an important time that we remember Obergefell because it was 4 years ago this week that decision was decided. It seems like it was an eon ago because look at everything that's happened and the way things have fallen by the wayside in the 4 years since. And you could probably go back and look at what I said on after June 26th or June 25th, whenever that came out the next Sunday, and see what I said 4 years ago. And I think I predicted that this is not going to end well. You remember President Obama? No, I'm not going to play a clip of him standing there in the White House garden and the Rose Garden, speaking to a bunch of supporters that were just so happy that we have same-sex marriage. Now it's been approved by the Supreme Court. Everything is great. And he said, now look, and folks, I'll paraphrase him. You're going to have to go educate your friends. They're not on board yet, but educate them and they'll come around because of course this is the only right way to think. And this is what Obama was right about anyway. So we have the cases. We had the case of Masterpiece Cake Shop and Jack Phillips. And what happened there was the court didn't really focus on the free exercise clause. They focused on the fact that the state of Colorado was being nasty to Mr. Phillips. So when the Flower case came up from the state of Washington, the Supreme Court sent it back and said, well, we looked at the case of Jack Phillips and he was treated badly. So we want to send it back to the state of Washington, the flower arranging case in the same-sex marriage ceremony. And Was she treated badly? Was the florist in that case treated badly? And the state of Washington, not surprisingly, if you have a half a brain, said, no, she was treated just fine. So there's no problem here. You know, she's out of business. And she was set up. I mean, the things that happened to her, she was friends with the people that did this. They didn't sue her. The state of Washington sued her, resulting in fines of into the six figures. And she's out of, she's essentially out of business. So I think that there's been, and there's an interesting editorial in the Wall Street also this week, how Masterpiece Cake Shop fell short. And the author is with the Alliance Defending Freedom. And I think he correctly notes that the courts are taking a very narrow view of the free exercise clause, and this is going to cause a lot of problems. In the academy, this is also true. This is a lady from, I believe she's from the United Kingdom. And what they did was she and two other people, her name is Pluckrose, which for somebody running kind of a sting operation on academics, I think Pluckrose is kind of a delicious sounding name, I guess is the best way to say that. It's like that really juicy icing flour on the wedding cake that you want, on your piece. And so anyway, but she says that, and she's been interviewed this week and by some places in Australia, and she gave a speech down there about highly paranoid worldview is corrupting our kids' thinking. Here's from the article in the Australian. Corrupt activist scholarship in gender, queer, and other identity fields is training the teachers who shape children and executives who run business, warns visiting culture critic Helen Pluckrose. I mean, her first name is even better, too. Helen Pluckrose, and I'm going to take you down. She says this is not a problem confined to esoteric arguments between intellectuals. Liberal academia has great cultural power. A generation of students were exposed to these ideas and went on to become leaders in various industries. Activists, academics turn out teachers of our children and the heads of our industries. And so what they did was they engaged in sort of a sting operation. They made up some research papers. They actually got them published in about 20 peer-reviewed journals. They made up fake research. And now, of course, their academic credential, at least one of them, are trying to revoke his teaching academic credentials because he was engaged in a fraud, ignoring for the fact that the whole research, peer review, journal thing is in large part based on fraud itself. And they were only trying to expose it. So and everybody's like, we have to really consider and we have to consider the ethics of what they did, but nobody ever considers the ethics of what they do when they try to change language and thought and that type of thing with their, frankly, I don't know how else to say it, nutty, moronic ideas. Let me see here. She says this, language is analyzed in a highly paranoid and offense-seeking way. Microaggressions are detected, racism and sexism identified, heteronormativity, acting as though heterosexuality is the default sexuality, is called out. Cisnormativity, acting as though people usually identify with the sex their reproductive systems indicate, is condemned. And she's exactly right. So I wasn't able to find her speech that she gave down in Australia, but you might plug in her name in YouTube. And you'll see she did give one interview there where she talked about this. It's a very interesting article, but it relates to this Orwellian culture that we live in. Here's one. This is just sort of related. In first states to legalize pot, teen use triggers concern. Now, listen, did anyone see this coming? I can't believe the teens are actually using pot. And it's much stronger than it was when we grew up in the 60s and 70s, people like me, my age. And yeah, we don't let them vape. We don't let them, smoke cigarettes. But, now they're doing pot and they're finding that they're having psychotic episodes because of the strength of the psychoactive ingredients in marijuana. And I can tell you in the legal field, law firm after law firm after law firm is trying to get into this business. And frankly, it makes me very uncomfortable. Because I've been to Colorado. I'm going to speak in Colorado in a few weeks at the One of Messiah conference and in Denver. And I was there 2 years ago. I was there recently, 2 years ago, I guess it was. And I can tell you, pot had been legalized. There were marijuana shops all over the place, and there are crazy people around. I remember the drive-through at McDonald's. The person could not function. There's no question in my mind that person was stoned. So it's a problem. But look, this change in language and the way they're trying to force things has consequences. This is a resolution that's being put through the California legislature right now by Kevin Lowe. Kevin Lowe is the person who last year they passed the law, went all the way up to be signed by the governor, and then he withdrew it. It passed the California legislature that would have banned anyone from selling any books that might speak against trying to reorient somebody to a heterosexual orientation, conversion therapy. So now here's one. So now they're taking a little bit different course. Well, now the law was too harsh, so now we're just going to do a resolution that sort of states what the sense of the law should be or how it should be interpreted. And look at what it says. It says, in a pluralistic society, people differing along spectrums of political and religious perspectives share a common responsibility of protecting the health and well-being of all children in vulnerable communities. Now, therefore, be it resolved. And what are they going to resolve? That in addressing the stigma often associated with persons who identify as LGBT, we call on the people of California, especially its counselors, pastors, religious workers, educators, and legislatures, and the institutions of California with great moral influence, especially its churches, universities, colleges, and other schools, counseling centers, activist groups, and religious centers, to model equitable treatment of all people of the state. In other words, here's what the thing is. Church leaders, either say what we want or butt out. It's exactly what they're saying. We don't care one whit about free exercise of religion. We don't care one whit about free speech. This is 1984 in California. Mark my words, this does not end well. Now, I think it's coming. I've been saying it's coming for a long time. I don't think it's coming. I think it's here. It's arrived. Okay, the Orwellian train is in the station. And as I said, 4 years ago, we saw this. I'm trying to remember where I picked this up from. This is from the resolution of California. The First Amendment ensures that religious organizations and persons are given proper protection as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faiths, and to their own deep aspirations to continue the family structure they have long revered. I'm sorry, this is from the Obergefell decision. The same is true for those who oppose same-sex marriage for other reasons. In turn, those who believe allowing same-sex marriage is proper, indeed essential, whether as a matter of religious conviction or secular belief, may engage those who disagree with their view in an open and searching debate. Anthony Kennedy said that, and he's foolish. He could not see what was coming. As smart as he was. I mean, I went to IU, he went to Stanford, I think. And I'm glad he's gone. And I wish a whole bunch of other ones up there were gone too. By retirement. Now, this is an interesting development. Izzy Folau. We've talked about him. He lost his contract with Rugby Australia because he had posted an Instagram post where he quoted from the book of Galatians. So his $4 million contract was terminated. He's banned from life from Rugby Australia. Now it comes out that what was going on in the background was the head of Qantas, the Australian airline, was pushing Rugby Australia. Hey, we're a sponsor of Rugby Australia. We don't want a guy like this speaking out. Even though it's not really specifically in his contract, you get rid of him or we're pulling our sponsorship money. So always follow the money. So somebody, by the way, if you're in Australia, you need to start a free that cute little koala bear movement to get free that koala bear from the grip of the fascists that run Qantas. Quote me. The guy is a fascist. He's a religious-hating fascist. And so Izzy Folau also pastors a small church like us. Maybe, I don't even know if it's as big as our church. Where would we run? 90, 100, 110 people here on Sunday. And he was preaching and he talked about what was going on. And what he said essentially was, listen, this whole transgender thing and pushing it on kids, this is of the devil, man. So immediately, now listen, they always say, well, listen, Izzy, you can't say this outside in public, but it's okay if you say it in your church. Look at the headlines. Is it okay if he just says it in church? They're targeting this guy, and all the things were, Izzy targets foul mouth, Izzy's new gay rant. Izzy targets this person, targets transgenders. And here's a little bit of what he said. They are allowing young kids in primary school to be able to have permission to change their gender if they want by taking away the permission of their parents. Now they're trying to take control as a government to make those decisions for young kids, basically that are 16 years old or younger. They don't even know what they're doing. This is what the devil's trying to do, to instill this into government, into this world, into society, and it's slowly happening, he said. I agree with everything he said except slowly. It's happening at light speed. Give the devil an opening, and he takes it. But I support what Izzy said. But look at these headlines. Izzy Folau targets gays, transgender children in his latest Sunday sermon. Now, personally, I think that a better way, and this was headlines all over Australia, paper after paper after paper, all the exact same thing, the same day. It's almost like they had it planned. Like, okay, folks, here's a memo. When Izzy Folau says what he really believes, this is how you go after him. He's targeting people. He's not targeting the poor children that are caught up in this. He's targeting the moronic parents and teachers and administrators and doctors and stuff that are shoving them into chemical castration and surgeries that alter their bodies forever when they haven't even reached puberty. This is a sickness almost, I don't know, unlike almost anything I've seen in our culture and society. This is sick. If you think this is good, you are mad. You are insane. You're demonic, actually. So maybe the headline should have said, Izzy Folau targets irresponsible people who chemically castrate children. So now, Folau sets up a GoFundMe site. You can find it to fund his estimated $3 million in legal fees that it's going to cost to challenge Rugby Australia. So the press let it go, right? They just, support Izzy. He has a right to challenge this in court. Headline after headline. The Bible casher, Folau slammed for greedy cash grab. And of course, then they put up all the properties that he owns, and he sold a $500,000 Lamborghini. And how dare he? In fact, one of his, I think, former teammates, Drew Mitchell, said this: you are in a fight that you chose to be in after you broke your terms of your contract. The kids below are in a fight they never wanted to be in, showing other people that go on GoFundMe to help fund operations. And yet you think you deserve donations more than they do. It's no longer about religion. It's about you and your greed. And you're going to see attack after attack after attack like that on this guy. So pray for Izzy. Go to GoFundMe if you want to support him. My understanding is that in just a few days, about over $500,000 has been raised. because the issue here is much bigger than Izzy Folau. This is about the free exercise of religion. And you can withdraw and just let it happen, or you can fight it. Make them look like the evil monsters that they really are, and fascists that they really are. Now, this is, of course, now I'm going to say, I said you could go about halfway through and you'd get the Middle East part of my update today. But listen, I think when I look at this, I think this is one of the most critical, important issues. This is an article, and I will give this as an op-ed that appeared Friday in the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Liberal Minneapolis, St. Paul. It says this: pediatric science clinics. We may look back and ask, what were we thinking? You should look up this article, the Star Tribune. Listen to this. In April 2019, the Twin Cities flagship facility for pediatric care, Children's Minnesota, launched a clinic for transgender and gender diverse young people. Ironically, within days of that opening, the Times of London reported that 5 clinicians at the Tavistock Centre's Gender Identity Development Service, England's only National Health Service pediatric gender identity clinic, had resigned as a matter of conscience. Praise the Lord for people who have conscience. The clinicians in England, the UK, expressed alarm over the number of adolescents being prescribed body-altering drugs at Tavistock. This experimental treatment is being performed on very vulnerable children who have experienced mental health difficulties, abuse, family trauma that are often whitewashed but may contribute to gender confusion, as one told the Times. Quote, I felt for the last 2 years what kept me in the job was a sense that there was a huge number of children in danger, and I was there to protect them from the service from the inside. And so here's the article from a Times of London investigation. That appeared recently. Meanwhile, the Star Tribune op-ed says, in Minneapolis, children's new gender clinic is portrayed as an unmitigated good. Yet what's happening in England, whereas here the number of young people presenting with gender confusion is skyrocketing, and this is borne out by all the statistics that I've seen, suggests that current treatment of pediatric gender identity problems ignores underlying causes and entails risks that are not being discussed. Several studies indicate that a strikingly high percentage of young people, especially girls who identify as transgender, have pre-existing autism, ADHD, and or psychological problems, all of which may underlie their gender confusion. Now, listen, if you've studied this for 10 minutes, you would say this is what's going on. There's something underlying this. It's not normal. But you can't even say that now. In the Times' words, a primary reason, according to the Times, is that transgender lobby groups are allegedly promoting transition as the cure-all solution for confused adolescents. As a result, although physicians hesitate to give estrogen to postmenopausal women or testosterone to men because of documented risks, some now dispense these powerful hormones to young people in cross-sex fashion to produce a cosmetic resemblance to the opposite sex. This neglect of normal medical protocol is especially troubling given the serious medical risks to young people. These are educated people who are doing this. It goes against all common sense. It's against science. I think Izzy's right. It's of the devil. Puberty blockers stunt growth and increase bone density. Their use followed by cross-sex hormones causes lifelong infertility. Perhaps most disturbingly, gender dysphoric youth are being advised to embark on this path despite the fact that a great majority of them, upwards probably over 90% of them, will desist and embrace their sex if supported through natural puberty according to research. That's the science. Don't accuse me of being anti-science. In 20 2017, Minnesota published, the Minnesota Department of Education published a toolkit ensuring safe and supportive schools for transgender and gender nonconforming students. As the article notes in the Star Tribune, the Minnesota Department of Education, far from urging a cautious approach to atypical gender identities, is suggesting to young people that gender dysphoria is a normal part of growing up. In 2017, the Department of Education approved a transgender toolkit for distribution to all public schools in the state of Minnesota. The toolkit instructs schools to treat transgender and gender nonconforming students as the gender they identify with for bathroom and locker room use, sports team participation, overnight accommodations on school trips, dress codes, pronoun use, and school records. And you say, oh, John, you're making it up, right? Here's a quote lifted directly from the thing: hotel accommodations. This is the end of at the end of this toolkit. If students are to be separated based on gender when traveling for athletic, educational, or cultural activities, school officials should allow a transgender or gender nonconforming student the opportunity to room with peers who match the student's gender identity unless the transgender or gender nonconforming student requests otherwise. If you're a girl and a guy wants to be in your room, you either shut up or you're off the team and you're maybe out of school. Do you understand how serious this stuff is? Was Orwell right? Is the Bible right that talked about these things, these days coming? At times, any student may have specific needs for privacy, and the school can make arrangements based on that student's wishes. It's insanity. Earlier in the report, it says this: if school staff determines the transgender student is not safe, the student support team should follow their protocol for reporting child neglect or harm. Parents, you're out of it. Izzy Folau was 100% right, except for saying that it's coming slowly. In England, I'm going to play you a couple-minute clip of a conversation between a school teacher and a student who was kicked out of class for saying there are only two genders. It was reported in the Sunday Mail this morning in London that the student has now been suspended from school for 3 weeks because he said, I believe there's only two genders. Listen to this. Think of Orwell. Listen to this.
You're entitled to your opinion. If I am, then why would you kick me out of class? It's not very inclusive.
You're not getting it? What's that? Okay. Well, let me just tell you what you can look it up on. It's on YouTube. It's all over the place. Essentially what the teacher's saying is you were rude. You said there are only two genders. Well, that's my opinion. That's science. He says, that's not official school policy. You were stating something that's contrary to official school policy. So so he's saying is you can't do this. And so you would think, well, somebody in the school system is going to have a clue. Somebody's going to have an idea. Somebody's going to have an idea that, this teacher was out of line, right? No, what's the result? This morning, London Mail, kicked out of school for 3 weeks, suspended. Permanently marked on his record. This is deeply disturbing and troubling to me. Listen, in Luke chapter 17, Jesus said, I think Jesus addressed this issue directly. Then he said unto the disciples, Luke 17:1, it is impossible, but that offenses will come, but woe unto him through whom they come. It would better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and he cast into the sea than that he should offend one of these little ones. This is exactly what is going on. You couple that with the verses which I've read over and over again in Luke chapter 17 about one of the characteristics of the time before the Lord returns would be, it would be as in the days of Lot. Now, there are people that are activists in the evangelical church, and I'm talking about in the church, that say, Lot, no. You got to look at the verse in Ezekiel and what was going on in Sodom. They were inhospitable. That it was the sin of inhospitality. Now, if I read Genesis, I know that when those angels showed up, that what did the men do? They came because they wanted to rape them. I agree. That is inhospitable. In to the 8,000th power. And anybody who says that it's just inhospitality, like it's no big deal, is a theological theomoronity, we could call it, or something like that. Well, last week we had Jonathan Merritt saying it was theolatry. So, look, this is what's going to happen. We know Romans 1. We can go through that whole sequence there. So this is very troubling. This is the world that we live in, and I think of all the things that I look at, this is like one of the most important harbingers that we really live near the time of the Lord's return. This stuff has, in 4 years, that we're talking about whether there should be same-sex marriage. Now we're talking about the fundamental issues of biology. Not human relationships, but biology. So, I don't know, maybe I need a GoFundMe account here. Okay. So let's, so this is some aerial photos. This is in this morning's New York Times, I believe. How big was last Sunday's protest in Hong Kong? It was huge. About 1/3 of everyone who lives in Hong Kong came out to protest. There are reports that they were singing Christian songs. And so I do believe there was a religious component to this. But the protest was over an extradition law that China wanted to impose on Hong Kong so that they could extradite people to China that lived in Hong Kong from virtually anywhere in the world. Now, why would they be concerned about that? Well, one thing that ought to concern you is yesterday, this is this Friday's New York Times. Here's a picture of President for Life Xi of China and baby Kim Jong, whatever his name is, Kim Jong-il from North Korea, from NOCO. And reports that I have from people that I trust that have very good contacts in our military, in defense departments, and that sort of thing, are telling me that at this meeting, Xi said, "Hey, Kim, anything you want to do with regard to the United States, go ahead." Because we were told that there'd be wars and rumors of wars, and I believe I see this happening. He goes and meets with one of the most brutal dictators on the planet. I should qualify that. Xi, comma, one of the most brutal dictators on the planet, comma, goes and meets with Kim, comma, one of the other most brutal dictators on the planet, period. And I don't think they're talking about things that are good. But why does this relate to the Hong Kong protest? This morning I found an article in the Spectator Australia. It seems like right now Australia is kind of like the front lines of everything. Even though they had an election that went, in a pretty good direction down there. But, the people that don't want that conservative Christian, Judeo-Christian values to predominate are fighting it. But this is the title of the article, China's Organ Grinder. China has gotten DNA information and health information on 19 million Uyghurs in China. 19 million. There are reports China has been pushing itself as the transplant center of the world. They have 160 transplant centers. They want to expand that in very short order to 300. Now, in order to do organ transplants, what do you need? You need organs. Where do you get organs from? Hopefully only dead bodies. Hopefully. 1 million or 2 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. Listen, the people in Hong Kong know what's going on. They see the surveillance society, built very often with American companies' technology. Now Facebook wants to put in their own currency. How do you think that's going to go? I saw somebody post this morning one of those little memes on Facebook. Hadn't been taken down yet, but it said this essentially, people that you say something Facebook doesn't like, you get put in Facebook jail. And now they said, we don't like what you said. We don't like the things you've been thinking. You're not allowed to use Facebook currency for 30 days at least to buy anything. Now, there's dispute exactly what the mark of the beast is, but it talks about controlling whether people can buy or sell. So let's assume that version that people hold to. Now, I personally think it's a much deeper spiritual thing, but at least this buy or sell thing, some people interpret that, and I kind of do too, I'll admit, that they want to control whether you can buy or sell. Do you see any trends operating in the world today moving towards that type of conclusion? Did the Bible prophesy that this would be the way things would go at the end? Okay, is the technology there? Are the people who want to do it there? Yeah, very often they live in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And they have all their little minions in Washington, D.C., some of whom don't really understand, I believe, the concept of a concentration camp and that sort of thing. But I don't want to, well, never mind. Okay. So let's look at the Middle East. You know where I'm going. Just, pause it there and go figure it out. Straits of Hormuz. These are the Straits of Hormuz. This is the peninsula that juts out into the Persian Gulf. This is along the coast here in the foreground of the picture is the United Arab Emirates, Dubai. That's where Dubai is located. The peninsula here, and then that body of water between the tip of the peninsula and Iran in the distance is the Straits of Hormuz. About a third of the world's oil passes through there. Oil is very important to the world economy. It's not as important to the United States because we're now essentially the world's largest oil exporter and oil and gas exporter. And we're essentially energy independent. But this is Dubai, that rich city with the multiple skyscrapers and the man-made islands out in the harbor. And so it was in there that the attack occurred. And this week, what happened was Iran shot down a U.S. drone. And so there was a lot of news media coverage about that. In the midst of all this, an interesting thing happened. Morsi, who was the Muslim Brotherhood dictator in charge of Egypt from 2012 to 2013, came about after that speech that Obama gave on June 4th, 2009 at Al-Azhar University and encouraged the Arab Spring, kicked off the Arab Spring, kicked off the Arab Spring. Go listen to that speech, man. His hands are all over this disruption in the Middle East. But Morsi came to power. He was supported by Erdogan of Turkey. This is Erdogan's paper, Daily Sabah, saying, he was killed by the Egyptian government. So now there's conflict between Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood. But the big issue was, let's see, well, I'll come back to this. I don't have time to come to this. There was a big, go up and look up the Jerusalem Post conference. You can listen to the speeches that were given. It was in New York City last Sunday. One of the things that was said there, Jason Greenblatt, who's on the negotiating team, essentially said, hey, I support what David Friedman said. David Friedman said Israel has a right to annex some of the land. I agree with that wholeheartedly. At the same time, all this is going on, the Netanyahu unveiled a sign for Trump Heights in the Golan, Israel's newest town. Somebody said, well, would you go there? And I'm like, I don't know. What's the golf course going to be like? Yeah, I would go play there. And, there might be some new bunkers made, here and there. I think back during World War II in England and Scotland, they actually had rules for how you played newly created bunkers from bombs that had fallen in the Nazi Blitz. Another article that was in the New York Times and the Center for Public Integrity appeared both places. Scary fast, how hypersonic missiles which travel at more than 15 times the speed of sound are touching off a new global arms race that threatens to change the nature of warfare. These things are one of the U.S. developed models is a Mach 14, 14 times the speed of sound, 14 times, what's the speed of sound, 750 or 680 miles per hour, around 700 miles per hour. So far, the article says there are no surefire defenses. Fast, effective, precise, and unstoppable. These are rare but highly desired characteristics on the modern battlefield, and the missiles are being developed not only by the United States, but also by China, Russia, and other countries. What happens when you launch one of these things is, first of all, you don't have any defense that you could deploy against such a missile. One of these can probably take out an aircraft carrier. Now, I don't think the technology is quite there, but if it's not there, it's pretty close. Here's what the article says. The arrival of such fast weaponry will dangerously compress the time during which military officials and their political leaders in any country can figure out the nature of an attack and make reasoned decisions about the wisdom and scope of defensive steps or retaliation. In other words, hey, there's a missile coming at you at 15 times the speed of sound. You better press the button right now and then worry about the consequences later. And the threat that hypersonics pose to retaliatory weapons creates what scholars call use it or lose it pressures on countries to strike first during a crisis. Experts say that the missiles could depend on the grim psychology of mutually assured destruction, the bedrock military doctrine of the nuclear age that argued globe-altering wars would be deterred if the potential combatants always felt certain of their opponent's devastating response. It's also interesting, and somebody pointed this out, this was from something that Chuck Missler said many years ago. He pointed out, well, they talk about in the end times, Jeremiah chapter 50 has a prophecy that says, their arrows shall be as a mighty expert man, none shall return in vain. In other words, you're not getting them back. The word there, arrow, is the word chetz, mean a dart, an arrow, or a javelin, or any missile fired from the engine of war. It is, and also notice that the mighty expert man describes the people who shoot it, the weapons, the arrow has like this knowledge, this technology that makes it very smart, which is exactly what the Bible was describing. At the same time, all of this is going on. Here's a report from Israeli News 7 about some military exercises that Israel is engaged in. Well, hang on here. Not getting it? Okay. Well, essentially, the report says that they had these massive military exercises in Israel, and they were preparing for war in many, many different theaters. So even though their elections are in a turmoil and that sort of thing, they're getting ready. They had really some of the largest military exercises in the history of Israel, and they used the F-35s in a military exercise for the first time. Those are the stealth fighter craft that they got from the United States. So back to the Straits of Hormuz. So Iran shoots down our drone. Now, this is a surveillance drone. It's not armed. It is a very expensive piece of equipment. I had a little graphic here someplace. This is all very fluid, and I apologize. Sometimes it looks like somebody, boy, John's not prepared. And I'm like, I am prepared. I'm just not organized. But anyway, this somewhere in here, I have a graphic about this. And sometimes the devil gets in my machine here, I think. So anyway, so here are the Straits of Hormuz. This is looking towards the south, essentially. You see here along the coast, you can see some of the man-made islands, the palm, and that sort of thing that have been put in place by in the United Arab Emirates, these huge man-made islands for very wealthy people. Iran shoots down the drone. Very interesting article. I went back and looked from about a year, almost exactly a year ago, in the Wall Street Journal, talking about Trump's Iran gambit. And at that time, the Wall Street Journal analyzed the situation between the United States and Iran, and they concluded that Trump seemed to want to get into some kind of negotiations with Iran. Didn't necessarily want to invade them, and I agree, invading Iran would be a disaster. Iran is not Iraq. It's a mountainous country. It's a natural fortress, has 4 times as many people as Iraq. It would be unlike anything the United States has ever engaged in. And this is an empire, a country, people who've been around for thousands of years, in part because of the nature, the geographical nature of their country. So, but it's interesting. This is from the article from a year ago. In the Soviet case, talks about the differences between Russia and China and Iran. And Spengler, David Goldman also had an article at Asia Times this week. And so a lot of people are saying, well, why would Iran do this? This isn't rational. Why would they do this? Now, it takes about 5 minutes to do research to find all of these articles and analyses that have been done to say that, listen, Iran would do this because they really are crazy. In fact, that was the title of David Goldman's article. One of the conclusions, Iran will probably not accept America's conditions for a grand bargain unless it is coerced to some degree. And, excuse me one second here, my things seem to be all messed up here. Okay, because I can't see my upcoming slides. So this is a very difficult geopolitical situation. But how does Trump respond? Well, Trump initially ordered a response, and then he called it back. So before Trump ordered the response, I was watching different things, CNN, MSNBC, because I like to torture myself. And they're all saying, oh, Trump, he's going to respond. He's going to respond. It's going to cause World War III. He's a crazy man. He's just going to pull the trigger. You know, we're in so much trouble. And then he didn't do anything. And then they all said, oh, man, he's so weak. Why didn't he do something? He should have done something. He's insane. It looked like he was going to do something. Then he didn't do something. He must be crazy. So it seemed like somebody's crazy in this whole scenario. Headlines all over the place. You know, this is Washington Post this morning. Iran crisis abates, but prospect of conflict persists. Wow, I had not figured that one out. And here at New York Times, options for Trump narrows as Iran standoff escalates. And so they're talking about, oh, what's he going to do? He doesn't have many options left. And listen, it is a very difficult situation. And it's a situation where they're going to criticize him if he does it. They're going to criticize him if he doesn't. And I accept that. Now, there are reports that the U.S. went in and engaged in some cyber attacks on their missile sites after the attack. Seth Frantzman at the Jerusalem Post wrote an article that was I think it's in today's paper. Yeah, it's in today's paper. Transformational moment amid heightened U.S.-Iran tensions. And he says this, and I agree. I think this is a great analysis. This is I think the key sentence in his article. Trump has another reason to be cautious. The U.S., Russia, and Israel are meeting this week, and the U.S. is pushing a Bahrain summit as well on June 25th. War would sabotage much of that and threaten U.S. troops. And I think that Seth Frantzman has a good analysis of what happened. And you see it right there on the front page of the Jerusalem Post this morning, next to the article, Bolton arrives in Israel amid heightened U.S.-Iran tensions. Over at Geopolitical Futures this week, George Friedman has a good article called The Jerusalem Talks. And he talks about, what's going to happen? What's this meeting between Russia, the U.S., and Israel really about? And his conclusion is it's in large part about Iran and the influence that Iran has over the region. He notes this in his article. Meanwhile, Israel's engaged in massive war games that appear to be focused on the Syrian border. Israel sees the presence of Iran and its proxies, including Hezbollah in Syria, as a direct threat to its security, a threat they've countered with periodic airstrikes on Iranian positions in Syria. By the way, if a limited strike was made on Iran, I don't think it causes a war. Israel has bombed Iranian targets in Syria dozens of times, at least, over the past several years. And has there been a war erupt? No, listen. There is a close relationship between the Iranian regime and North Korea. And the one thing that I don't understand that people haven't really pointed out is is there any parallels between how little Kim negotiates and how Iran negotiates? And the answer is no, they negotiate in the same way. They do these crazy things, but they're not so much to provoke a war, they're to provoke a negotiation. That's how they negotiate. And Spengler, I think, is correct, that they really are crazy. So George Friedman and others conclude, and I think it's correct, that a lot of what's going to be talked about in Jerusalem starting tomorrow in the summit with Israel, United States, and Russia security chiefs is the Iran problem. I don't think Russia's interests necessarily line up with Iran's. Russia would not, in some respects, as long as it was out of it, I don't think it would mind seeing a war that raised oil prices. Why? Because that's how oil and gas drives the Russian economy. So if there's a war between U.S. and Iran, oil prices go up, there's problems with shipping. They're way up north. They're not involved in it, so they can continue to produce their oil and make some more money. Russia says, look, Iran is in Syria at the moment at the invitation of the legitimate government and is actively involved in fighting terrorism. Therefore, we will have to take into account the interests of Iran. Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev said. That's what he says. So it appears that this is a very important meeting. It'll be interesting to see how it goes because, all these players, I think, are involved in Bible prophecy. And I think everybody thinks there's a war coming at some point. How quickly? Don't know. I hear a lot of people, it's going to be tomorrow. I think more likely towards the fall. That's just my personal opinion, if things continue to unfold as they have. Let's see. Jason Greenblatt at the Jerusalem Post Conference said, settlements are not the reason for lack of peace. And then yesterday, I was enjoying a nice sunny, rare for us this year, sunny summer day. And lo and behold, here comes Jared Kushner and decides to release the economic part of the plan that's going to be introduced at the Bahrain summit in 2 days in Bahrain. He gave some interviews. There's a good interview with him at Reuters. Again, I apologize. My clips are not playing for some reason. Here's a cover of the plan, the economic plan that's part of their what's called the deal of the century that the president is supposedly putting together. It's interesting. The news this morning looked at things and they said, Trump never used the term deal of the century. That came from a translation, and it just was something that picked up and people liked it. So Trump's not calling that now. Everybody else is, so that's what we're talking about. But even the Arab News says, listen, we don't think that, don't give that to Trump. Not the deal. That's not what he says about his peace plan that's supposedly coming, that continually is delayed. But anyway, here's the economic part. Peace to prosperity. Here's Jared Kushner being interviewed at Reuters. They're going to invest $50 billion into the region. You can download the PDF of the document. It's about 40 pages long. Here is a summary of what they say. 10-year plan calls for projects worth $27.5 billion in the West Bank and Gaza. Also, additional monies flowing into for Palestinians in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. You see the amounts there. Creation of a master fund to administer the finance and implementation of the projects. And then linking the West Bank and Gaza with a modern transportation network, including high-speed rail service. And that's the one that's going to be, I think, problematic for Israel. And listen, what happened? Immediately, the Palestinians come out and say, we reject this. Just like they've rejected everything else. Gantz, who's running for the Blue and White Party, with the Blue and White Party against Netanyahu, says the economic deal will only work if Gaza is demilitarized. So listen, this thing is not going to work. I don't think it's going to be implemented, and I think it's very naive. They've tried these economic plans. The reasons that the Palestinians oppose this are not because of economics. It's just not true. Of course, there are protests immediately about this. David Friedman and Greenblatt are saying, "Oh, this will jumpstart the West Bank economy. Everybody will have jobs. Everybody will get along." Spengler, David Goldman. I went back and I looked, and this is an article from I think 2015. I don't see the date on it. Humiliation is the only path to peace for the Middle East. And I think this is a very good article. Daniel Pipes at the Middle East Forum has also said similar things, that we've never really defeated the Palestinians. And until they're ready to cry uncle, it's not going to work. This is Goldman, from Goldman's article. Even if the Jews have the Mediterranean coast, they do not have Jerusalem. Speaking of the Arabs. I'm sorry. This is the way the Arabs think. Even if the Jews have the Mediterranean coast, they do not have Jerusalem, their ancient capital and the holiest of Jewish sites. The Arabs console themselves. And right, this article is from December 2017, when came out right after Trump moved the embassy, U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, Israel's capital. They do not have it because the nations of the world refuse to say that they have it. And so what happened was in 2017, remember everybody said, "Oh, Trump, if you move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, the Middle East is going to explode." Well, it's already exploding, but it's going to be really bad. Well, has anything really of major consequence happened relative to that move? No. So it was just a bunch of people who didn't know what they were talking about. And so this is what Goldman says, this is how the Arabs looked at it. To state the obvious, namely that Jerusalem is and will remain the capital of the state of Israel, is a humiliating dictum. If the so-called microaggressions are now aboard at American universities are pinpricks, the declaration that Jerusalem is Jewish is a stab at the heart. And so this has been what's happened. This week, there was a good paper at the JCPA.org, Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs.org, JCPA.org, talking about the fact that in Jerusalem, Ramallah, where the Palestinians have their capital, and in Gaza, they're very upset because the Saudis and others are moving in and sort of spreading money around especially in East Jerusalem, and sort of engaging buying influence. And Jordan's upset with it. The Palestinians are upset. So listen, this is not all about Israel. This is about a very tricky geopolitical situation. Now, Goldman, in his article in 2017, he noted this article from Mosaic, which is dated in 2015, What Do Palestinians Want? And the subtitle is, It's Time to Take a Close Look at an Often Ignored Subject. What ordinary Palestinians think about Israel, Jews, and terrorist attacks on civilians. So what this article, the person who wrote this article on Mosaic did was they went and they surveyed about 300 opinion polls, surveys that have been done of Palestinian people. And they tried to coalesce all that and to analyze it. And they came up with a number of interesting findings. For example, 98% of Palestinians said the killing of 29 Palestinians in Hebron by Baruch Goldstein at the Tomb of the Patriarchs was terrorism. But only 15% were willing to say the same for an attack by suicide bombers that killed 21 Israelis in Tel Aviv. So here we have a problem with people who, by and large, think a totally different way. And economics are not going to mean anything to these people. Another finding, 61% thought it morally right to name streets after Palestinian suicide bombers like Dalal al-Maghrib, who killed Israeli civilians within Israel. And you drive down the streets of Nablus, and every intersection is this martyr, that martyr square. There are pictures of these guys just before they did their suicide bombers painted on walls all over Nablus, which is one of the hotbeds of where these terrorists come from. The article says this in the Mosaic. Given such a negative view of Israelis and Jews and of the Jewish link to the land, it is hardly surprising that most ordinary Palestinians do not believe that the Jews have a right to a state there. In 1995, when JMCC asked whether Israel had a right to exist, 65% responded negatively when surveying Palestinian Arabs. Similarly, in a 2015 poll commissioned for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy by David Pollack, who has conducted surveys of the Arab world for more than 2 decades, field workers from the Palestinian Center for Public Opinion asked residents of the West Bank and Gaza, do you think that Jews have some rights to the land along with Palestinians? Only 12% agreed with that, while more than 80% asserted this is Palestinian land and Jews have no rights to it. So from 1995, we had Oslo in 93, we had all these efforts by the Clinton administration, we had all the stuff by the Obama administration, even the Bush administrations. And what happened? Did they get more accepting of a Jewish state of Israel than they were before? No, they got worse. And here's the report that was published by David Pollack. Here, look, these are graphs from his report. This is Palestinian land and Jews have no rights to it. 80.5% say that in the West Bank, 87.7% in Gaza. These were surveys done in 2015. Regardless of what you personally prefer, the question is, which do you think will be the fate of Israel realistically in 30 or 40 years? And you look down here and you see the big spike here. Israel will no longer exist because Arab or Muslim resistance will destroy it. Almost 20% in the West Bank believe that, 1/3 of Gaza. So this plan of Kushner, he's going to get to spend some time in Bahrain with his oil-rich buildings, buildings built from oil riches and everything. But listen, this is not... it's not going to be accepted. There's something more that's coming. And I think that until there's that sort of humiliation of a defeat, nothing's going to progress. There has to be a war to do it. Goldman, in his article about humiliation as the key to Middle East peace, and this would track with what Daniel Pipes has said in some other articles, is that until Goldman did a survey many years ago, and he looked at all these wars, Napoleonic Wars, Peloponnesian Wars, on and on, World War I, the American Civil War. And what he found, until the losing side loses 30% of its fighting men, meaning everyone who's going to fight to the death has fought to the death, you're not going to have peace. That's when you'll have peace. Now, that's not a very enticing prospect, but I think all of this is window dressing, and whether I don't want it, I'm just saying that I think there will be a war at some point. And here's the article from the JCPA that I talked about, Tectonic Shifts in Israel and Jerusalem's Islamic Arrangement. And this is a concern to the Palestinians. They feel like they're losing control. So, maybe they're on the verge of that humiliation that David Goldman talked about a few years ago. But listen, it's all placed into Bible prophecy. I think Jesus knew what he was talking about when he said near the end, before the end, he says, when you hear wars and rumors of wars, know that the end is not yet. So, but I think sort of an implication from that is that when there are wars of a certain kind, then the end is really close. So I think we're in that wars and rumors of war stage, and we'll just have to see how it unfolds. But it's a very interesting time to be alive. So what's the old saying? What did my friend Zola Levitt always used to close this program with? Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Now that brings in a whole lot of other things. Disciples are told to be shod. Your feet shod with what? The gospel. Put on the armor of God, and your feet are shod with what? Gospel of peace. That is an aspect of the gospel that I think is ignored, is that people need to prepare for the coming kingdom. Not bringing the kingdom in, but prepare for the coming kingdom when the King of Peace returns. And that's what we look for. So let's pray, and we'll pick up with this next week. Father, thank you for your word. We pray that you will give us opportunities to share the gospel with those around us this week. Bless us this week in Jesus' name. Amen.